Okay, so we've looked at two examples of dynamic programming problems. One was the rod cutting problem. The second was the all shortest paths problem in a weighted directed graph. Okay, so the basic approach in dynamic programming is you start out with some problem that seems very complicated. You try to find some recursive approach to break that big problem down into smaller subproblems in such a way that you know you can eventually find an answer. And you do have to methodically solve every subproblem so that you can get to an eventual solution. But the trick is to define your recursion in such a way that small subproblems are evaluated first, and you can memoize the results of those small subproblems so that as your algorithm keeps grinding along, you can simply look up these memoized results rather than recomputing them. And the goal here is to take an exponential order algorithm and convert that into a polynomial order algorithm. For example, for our Fibonacci numbers, we found that by simply adding memoization, we could convert an exponential algorithm into an order n algorithm. For rod cutting, we saw that we could convert an exponential algorithm into an n squared algorithm. And for our all shortest paths problem, we were able to find an n cubed algorithm. We're usually in dynamic programming trying to maximize or minimize some so-called objective function, and we'll be faced with having to make decisions along the way about which choices we should make. Now, we're not going to try to be smart about making good choices. We're simply going to try every possible choice and figure out which sequence of choices gives us the best result. Where we're going to try to be clever is in organizing the order in which we make these decisions in such a way that memoization is effective in reducing our runtime. Okay, so here's the next problem we're going to look at. How similar are two sequences of characters, or two sequences of symbols, or perhaps two sequences of words? Now, of course, this entails deciding what similar even means. Do we mean, for example, in a human language, similar in meaning, or just similar in structure, or similar in vocabulary, or what? So the measure we're going to look at here is what's called the longest common subsequence, which is simply the maximum number of symbols that we can find in common between two sequences in which those symbols occur in the same order. All right, so here we have two sequences of 7 symbols, GATTACA and TACTGTC. These sequences are short enough that we can discover just by brute force and intuition that ATTC is the longest sequence of symbols that occurs in the same order in each of those two sequences of 7 symbols. So the longest common subsequence between these two sequences is ATTC with length 4. All right, well, intuition and brute force are not going to be good plans for long sequences. We have to come up with some recursive algorithm that will handle any kinds of sequences. To do this, we usually start with some very simple example and try to build up our examples. For example, what if our sequences are just one character long, G versus T, or C versus C, let's say? Well, that isn't really too interesting. That doesn't tell us much because G and T are not the same, C and C are the same, so all we can tell from this is that the longest common subsequence for one character sequence is going to be either 0 or 1. So let's try comparing just the first few characters of one string to a longer string. We'll start here with our entire first sequence of symbols, GATTACA, and we'll see how we do comparing just the first character of the second sequence, and then the first 2 characters of the second sequence, and so on. Let's see if that gets us anywhere. Well, the first symbol in the second sequence is T. And as we scan through the symbols in the first sequence, we discover T doesn't match G or A, but it does match T. So we have found a longest common subsequence to that point of 1. And in fact, since there is only one symbol in our second sequence in this case, we can't do better than 1. All right, so let's see how we go with the first 2 symbols from the second sequence. Well, once again, we're able to find T. Continuing on, we're also able to find A. So that gives us a longest common subsequence of 2. And again, since the second sequence only has 2 symbols in it, that's the best we're going to be able to do. Well, this is interesting now. So what's happened here is that we have found a T, and then in the remaining part of the first sequence, we have searched for and found an A. All right, so we search for the first character until either we find it or not. If we do find it, we search for the second character and whatever remains. If we don't find the first symbol, we'll simply have to ignore it and see if we can find the second symbol. All right, so this seems like it might be developing into an idea. We are able to find in sequence the 3 symbols TAC. When we get to TACT, however, we do find a T. Then in the remaining subsequence, we find an A. In the remaining subsequence, we find a C, but we don't find a T after that C. So at this point, we've got a longest common subsequence of 3. And for whatever good this might do us, we'll just observe that the longest common subsequence has to be less than or equal to the minimum of the length of the 2 sequences of symbols. Does it make any difference if we compare the other direction? That is, if we compare subsequences of the first sequence with the entire second sequence. All right, well, G does exist once in the second sequence. G followed by A doesn't improve things because following the G in the second sequence, there is no A. GAT, well, we're not able to find the A following the G, but we are able to find a T. So that gives us a longest common subsequence of 2 symbols. All right, so to test all possibilities, what we're going to have to do is to compare every possible subsequence of the first sequence to the second sequence, and every possible subsequence of the second sequence to the first sequence. Now, how many possible subsequences are there of the first sequence? Suppose there are n symbols in the first sequence. A subsequence is either going to contain a symbol or not contain a symbol. So there's 2 choices for each symbol. And unfortunately, that means that there's 2 to the n choices that we're going to have to test. That is, we've got 2 to the n possible subsequences that we can generate from a sequence of n symbols. All right, we really don't want to have a 2 to the n kind of algorithm. So let's see if we can figure out some clever memoization that helps us avoid that. Okay, well, since each character in the first sequence could be the first character of the longest common subsequence, and likewise each character of the second sequence could be the first character in the longest common subsequence, let's set up a table with the symbols in the first sequence for our rows and the symbols in the second sequence for our columns, and see if, starting from the upper left corner, we can fill this in with the longest common subsequence that we can find up to some prefix of the first sequence versus some prefix of the second sequence. If this works for us, where m is the number of symbols in the first sequence and n is the number of symbols in the second sequence, then we will end up having created an m by n algorithm rather than a 2 to the n algorithm. So in the first row, we're simply going to test G against increasing prefixes of the second sequence, TAC, TG, TC, and see what the longest common subsequence is that we found so far. So comparing G to T, well, we have nothing in common, so the longest common subsequence of G versus the prefix T is 0. Likewise, G doesn't match A, so up to there the longest common subsequence is still 0. G does not match C, G does not match T, but here G does match G. So starting at the fifth symbol in the second sequence, we do have a longest common subsequence that's 1 long. Since the prefix in the first sequence that we're checking is only 1 character so far, that's the longest we can have, and so we just fill in the remaining cells in that first row with 1 as well. Filling in the first column is similarly easy, comparing the 1 symbol prefix T with these increasingly long prefixes G, GA, GAT, and so forth. All right, so we already know that T does not match G. Does T match A? No, so the longest common subsequence of the prefix T versus GA is 0. Now T does match T, so the longest common subsequence of T versus GAT is going to be 1. And since there's only 1 symbol in the second sequence here in our prefix, all the remaining rows are going to be filled in with 1 as well. Okay, so we took care of the trivial cases, comparing G against increasingly long prefixes of TAC, TG, TC, and likewise comparing T against increasingly long prefixes of GAT, TACA. So now we get to the hard part. What do we do now in the second row? Okay, we would like to be able to determine what the longest common subsequence is, comparing the prefix GA of the first sequence to the prefix TA of the second sequence. Okay, so let's just call the rows S1, that's sequence 1. So our sequence 1 here, the rows are G, A, T, T, A, C, A. And the columns we'll call S2, T, A, C, T, G, T, C in this example. And in general, we're asking the question, can we figure out the longest common subsequence at some location JK in this matrix just by looking at immediately neighboring cells? We don't want to have to reevaluate a whole bunch of past knowledge in order to figure out what the longest common subsequence is up to the current cell that we're trying to fill in. Okay, so we know the letter in the row, we know the letter in the column, and we know the longest common subsequences up to the previous column, the previous row, or the previous row and column. Well, let's think about this. Suppose that the two letters do match. In this case, the letter A in the row does match the letter A in the column. Then we need to add 1 to our longest common subsequence, but where does the value come from that we add 1 to? Well, the prefixes up to these A's were the prefix G for the rows, the prefix T for the columns, and the longest common subsequence up to there was 0. Consequently, if we have moved 1 character forward in the row and 1 character forward in the column and discovered a match, the longest common subsequence up to that point must be 1 plus whatever the longest common subsequence was up to the previous shorter prefixes. So it's going to be 0 plus 1. On the other hand, continuing in that same row, where we have A as the end of the prefix in the row, when we get to C, the next character in the sequence for the columns, we discover that A is not the same as C, and therefore the longest common subsequence up to that point must be either the longest common subsequence of G versus TAC or of GA versus TA. So since we're still working in the same row containing A, and we have added another column containing C, we're going to take the maximum of this row in the previous column, which is 1, or this column in the previous row, which is 0. So the longest common subsequence up to this point is 1. Now we have a recipe. As we step through the remaining cells in this row, if we discover that our current row letter and our new column letter are the same, we should add 1 to whatever the longest common subsequence is up to the previous shorter prefixes. On the other hand, if we add another column and discover that that column's letter does not match the current row's letter, then we simply select the maximum of the new column up to the shorter prefix or the previous column up to the current prefix. All right, so we will simply mechanically fill in all of the remaining cells in the matrix following that recipe. And what we discover in the lower right corner, according to this recursion using the formula that we just talked about, is that the longest common subsequence of the prefix GATTACA versus the prefix TACTGTC is 4. And you can make a copy of this previous slide and track it through, and you'll see that you end up with this m by n matrix of values shown here. All right, so that tells us the length of the longest common subsequence, but can we find out what the actual longest common subsequence is? Yes, it turns out that we can do that using the same information and sort of working our way backward from the lower right corner. What we do is we compare the value in the current cell with the value on the same row in the previous column, or the value in the previous row on the same column. Here, the value in the previous row on the same column is equal to our value of 4 in the lower right corner. Hence, the A in the last row did not increase the longest common subsequence, and therefore is not part of the longest common subsequence. That means that we can move up a row and still have a longest common subsequence up to that point of 4 characters. So we have moved up to the row containing C from the row containing A. Now at this point, when we do our comparison, the 3 in the row above and the 3 in the column to the left are both less than the current longest common subsequence. That must mean that this character C, which is the same in the row and the column, is the final character in our longest common subsequence. So we'll record that character C, and we'll move up and to the left to start checking characters in the shorter row and column prefixes. So we're going to record the C and move up and to the left. At this point, we look in the previous column and the previous row and discover that the previous row has the same value as 3, so we move up to that row. Here, the row is T, the column is also T, and we discover that the previous column and previous row are both less than 3, so we're going to record that T and move up and to the left. All right, so we have now discovered that T and C are the last 2 characters in our longest common subsequence. At this point, we look above and to the left and discover that 2 to the left is equal, so we'll move to the left. And now, our row is T, our column is also T, we discover that the longest common subsequence is less than 2 in both the previous column and the previous row. So we record this t and move up to the left. We now know that TTC are the last 3 characters in our longest common subsequence, and we're up here at this 1. Now at this 1, we're going to move to the left. Now we're in the row and column containing A. We move up to the left one more time, having recorded that A, and we're done. We're in a cell now containing 0, indicating that up to that point, there are no common subsequences between the prefix G of the first sequence and the prefix T of the second sequence. So we're done, and we have found that ATTC is a shortest common subsequence. Okay, so that demonstrates an approximately n-squared algorithm, technically n times n algorithm, as opposed to a 2 to the n algorithm for finding the longest common subsequence between 2 different sequences.